Hi, Philosophy of the Arts students. I'm Professor Longton. This is your teaching assistant, Finnegan, and we will be talking about Audre Lorde's Poetry is Not a Luxury. Audre Lorde is a 20th century American poet, thinker, and activist. She describes herself as Black, lesbian, mother, warrior, poet. She was born to immigrant parents in New York City and educated at Hunter College. And she started publishing poetry as early as the age of 19. She describes herself as thinking in poetry. Even when she was a child, if people asked her, what happened to you yesterday or how are you feeling? She says she would recite a poem, and somewhere in that poem would be a line or feeling that she was sharing. So she always communicated through poetry, and it was really a natural and essential way that she was able to think through, process, and express her feelings. And before we look at her essay, I wanted to share one of her poems with you. This is one of my favorite poems, Recreation or Recreation, right? So in the title, we're already having this sort of duality of how we can possibly interpret this poem. So recreation. Coming together, it is easier to work after our bodies meet. Pen and paper neither care nor profit whether we write or not. But as your body moves under my hands, charged and waiting, we cut the leash. You create me against your thighs, hilly with images, moving through our word countries. My body writes into your flesh the poem you make of me. Touching you, I catch midnight as moon fires set in my throat. I love you, flesh into blossom. I made you and take you made into me. So one of the reasons I really love this poem, whether you think of it as recreation, right, a sort of activity that is for pleasure, or recreation, right, creating something anew, maybe transforming something through creation, it really captures what I think poetry does, right? Poetry is very sensuous, and this poem is particularly sexy. It seems as though we're describing two lovers in each other's arms, and how that act of coming together kind of recreates both of them and turns each other into this poem that they're sharing. And when we read someone's words, right, when someone shares their words through poetry, that too is an act of intimacy and vulnerability that changes and transforms who we are. So I think in this poem, Audre Lorde is able to capture a lot of what poetry does when we write it and when we read it. So her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, is from 1977, and it's part of this collection of essays and speeches if you want to read more of her work. She starts out her essay by talking about poetry as helping us to express these sort of latent, implicit, and sort of deep wells of feeling and thought that are within us. So she says, the quality of light by which we scrutinize our lives has direct bearing upon the product which we live and upon the changes which we hope to bring about through those lives. It is within this light that we form those ideas by which we pursue our magic and make it realized. This is poetry as illumination, for it is through poetry that we give name to those ideas which are, until the poem, nameless and formless, about to be birthed, but already felt. So she is trying to think about poetry as a type of illumination and a type of magic that makes something come to life, that sort of manifests something that comes from deep within us. So the title of this essay, right, Poetry is Not a Luxury, has to do with changing the way we think about poetry so that it's not something that is elitist, it's not something that's esoteric, and that you have to have a lot of special training and special knowledge and education to understand, right? She's trying to think of poetry as something that kind of wells up from inside of us, that poetry is kind of a way of becoming our true selves by letting this light that comes from within kind of have an exit and open up towards the world. So poetry is illumination, poetry is opening up, poetry is magic. Poetry isn't fancy old people and books and being a sort of elite educated person. She says that poetry comes from our experiences. So this is another way that she's trying to take this idea of poetry as kind of belonging in the ivory tower or belonging on this pedestal, the great poets, the great bards that have been passed down through these canons over the age. And instead she's saying that poetry doesn't come from this sort of above elevated position of power. In fact, poetry comes from our experiences. It's this expression of what we experience. So she says that distillation of experience from which true poetry springs births thought, as dreams birth, as dream births concept, as feelings birth idea, as knowledge births and precedes understanding. Okay, so in this quote, right, she's saying that poetry comes from our experiences of the world. And just as concepts come from dreams and ideas come from feelings and understanding comes from knowledge. So what she's trying to do here is think about the sort of genesis or origin of where our ideas, our knowledge, our understanding come from. And so she's in a way placing this emphasis on feeling and dream that make them the sort of basis for knowledge instead of something that is just a sort of recreational activity or a luxury or something on top of that, right? So daydreaming is something you could take to be a very luxurious activity. It's something where if you have a lot of leisure or it doesn't seem to be a practical activity where you're like earning money or working or doing something. And so we might take dreams as being unimportant. But she's telling us that concepts come from dreams, right? We need to kind of brainstorm. We need to think about things. We need to kind of go into these darker recesses of our minds and play with ideas to arrive at new concepts. So concept formation actually comes from dreams. Dreaming is not the antithesis of conceptual thought. And in the same way, feelings and ideas go together. So sometimes people really want to separate rational thought and ideas from feelings. And she is saying that those ideas already come from a feeling, right? And that's partly because everything is based in our experience. If you think about an experience you have, even a very mundane experience, it's always going to have a mood. It's always going to have a feeling to it. You can't really take that feeling or mood or atmosphere or whatever emotionally is going on away from the experience. So if I'm talking about my experience today, recording this lecture, thinking about Audre Lorde, thinking about poetry, I can't quite separate it from a number of feelings or even just the general mood going on right now. The mood of I'm in quarantine, I'm at home, I can't leave this place. So all of that is sort of a part of that experience. And whatever ideas are going to come to my head are going to kind of be birthed from those feelings. So there's a sort of origin, there's a sort of depths from which our ideas come. And that is going to be full of feeling. So she continues on page 37 and she says, I speak here of poetry as a revelatory distillation of experience, right? A revelatory distillation of experience. So if you distill something, right, you kind of get it to its purest form. You take away the sort of things that are not important, the sort of byproducts, and you get at what is most sort of essential to that thing. And so poetry gets at what is essential about experience. It reveals something that is sort of at the core of whatever that experience is. So I speak here of poetry as a revelatory distillation of experience, not the sterile wordplay that too often the white fathers distorted the word poetry to mean in order to cover a desperate wish for imagination with insight. So she doesn't want to think of poetry as just beautiful language or fun wordplay. She wants to think of it as something that reveals what our experiences are. And she's thinking about where poetry comes from, right? She says, these places within ourselves are dark because they are ancient and hidden. They have survived and grown strong enough through that darkness. Within these deep places, each one of us holds an incredible reserve of creativity and power, of unexamined and unrecorded emotion and feeling. So she's thinking of poetry, especially coming from places of darkness, right? Not just positive feelings, but the feelings that are sort of dark and murky. And she writes a lot about pain and fear, and how she's able to kind of get a perspective on her fear and her pain. And that for her is this reserve of strength, this reserve of creativity and power, is to tap into those places and not try to repress them or ignore them or sort of pave over them, but to look to those sort of dark places within, where there is suffering, where there is pain, and where there's a struggle for freedom. She wants to link poetry particularly to her experience as being an African-American woman in the 20th century United States. So she says, for women, poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence, right? So this is a huge statement. Poetry isn't something for fancy people in fancy schools. Poetry is something that women need. It is necessary to their existence. She says, it forms the quality of light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change. First made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action, right? So she's thinking of poetry as being the way that we are able to survive in a world that is hostile to us. Poetry gives us these tools for taking language and turning impossible situations into hopes and dreams and trying to make that tangible, trying to act towards these hopes and dreams we're able to create through whatever poetry opens up for us. So she says, poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so that it can be thought. Right, so this is a really important statement. I don't know if you've ever had this experience in your life where you're really struggling through something. And at the beginning of it, maybe you can't make sense of it at all. You don't know how you feel. You don't know how to name your pain. You don't know how to put your finger on exactly what is wrong, why you feel restricted, or why you feel as though you're not able to sort of overcome a particular obstacle or challenge, or even exactly what that obstacle is. And then when you think through it and process it, you're able to kind of name it, and that helps you to kind of make sense of it and figure out what you need to work past it, and how to find help, how to go to others, how to express your pain to others as well. And so a lot of kind of working through whatever personal issue might happen in your life has to do with finding the language for it. I had this experience when I was going through a divorce, and when I first started going through it, I had a lot of negative language I was using, right? I said, my marriage is failed. I have a failed marriage. And over time, I was able to kind of adopt different language to describe what was going on, that helped me to deal with it and not put it in the sort of terms of failure, because that made it sound like, I got a bad grade on an assignment, or I lost my job or something. And that wasn't exactly what happened, right? It was more about growing in a different direction from someone, wanting to hold on to a friendship, but not being able to remain a couple. And so I was able to find new language to kind of describe the struggle. And that helped me to get through this sort of personal issue. So poetry in a way helps us with this, because poetry is that struggle for language, particularly sort of emotionally charged, intense situations that can be difficult to find the language. That's where poetry is most vital. That's where poetry kind of uses its particular sort of way of working with language, right? Which is highly expressive, highly emotional, sometimes ambiguous, very creative, able to create new words and phrases and meanings. And so poetry really holds that place for helping us to name the nameless. So she says, the farthest horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives. So again, she's really anchoring poetry in our everyday lives. Poetry is not some sort of luxury. It's not like a luxury cruise or a luxury vacation where you're really lucky or you do it every once in a while. She's saying that poetry comes from that sort of most foundational part of who we are. She wants to contrast poetry to a sort of tradition of rational thought. She says that, we have these thinkers, right? I think, therefore I am comes from Descartes' Meditations. And there's this entire tradition in sort of Western thought that favors rational ideas divorced from emotion. And it sort of favors these because the idea is that it's supposed to be more objective, it's supposed to be more truthful if it doesn't have feeling. Feeling is personal, feeling is individual, feeling is not objective. And the thing is it's not quite clear that we can take thoughts and have completely emotionless thought. When we do that, thought becomes very, very abstract. In fact, it becomes so abstract, we're not sure anymore how it might apply to our lives or what its meaning is. And so Audre Lorde is trying to tell us that we shouldn't be favoring rational thought divorced from emotion. Instead, we need to look to what feeling does tell us, right? So feeling has a sort of sensitivity to our experiences, to what's going on, to how other people are treating us. And so if we're discounting feeling, we're probably discounting a lot of information about our experiences. And so instead of saying, I think, therefore I am, as Descartes says, Audre Lorde wants to say, I feel, therefore I can be free, right? So poetry comes from this sort of deep feelings within us, articulating them, giving them a name, trying to turn them into language. And she thinks that this is going to be the source of our freedom. She says, as they become known to and accepted by us, our feelings and the honest exploration of them become sanctuaries and spawning grounds for the most radical and daring of ideas, right? So being able to tap into your feelings, being able to explore them and find the words for them really creates a sort of sanctuary, right? This place for growth. Where we can become more daring, where we can be more creative, where we can generate these really radical ideas that might actually change our circumstances and transform the world, right? So delving into our feelings rather than ignoring them or repressing them or saying that they're lesser than rational thought, for her, this is going to be the sort of path we need to take. And poetry is going to be this path. So she says, this is not idle fantasy, right? It's not idle fantasy. It's not just imagination or dreaming, but a disciplined attention to the true meaning of it feels right to me, right? That sort of instinctual or gut feeling that tells us the way something is requires attentiveness. You actually have to train yourself to be able to realize what you feel, how you feel, why you feel that way, and what to do with it. So we can train ourselves to respect our feelings and to transpose them into a language so that they can be shared. Right? So that's an entirely another skill, not just being able to sort of recognize your feelings, but also being able to find the language so that you can communicate them to others and share them with others. And that's where connection happens. And that's where change can happen, is through that sort of creating connections, creating relationships with others, and building something together. So she says, and where that language does not yet exist, it is our poetry which helps to fashion it. So it's very challenging to figure out feelings, to explore them, to create new ideas, to communicate those new ideas to other people, and to do that in a way where there's this exchange that can actually create action. And a lot of that really has to do with language, right? It's not just acting, but it's the communication part, the finding the words, the giving of words, and the shared words that become a part of whatever collective action you're a part of. And so she says that it's really poetry that helps us find the language for these things. We have to craft new language. This is why language becomes so important in any sort of civil rights movement, right? Don't say this instead. Or you have a phrase that becomes really important to a movement. And that's because the words, there's been a lot of effort to find the words exactly for that emotion, exactly for that injustice, exactly for that feeling that is motivating the movement. So poetry helps us fashion these words. She says, it is our dreams that point the way to freedom. Those dreams are made realizable through our poems that give us strength and courage to see, to feel, to speak, and to dare. Right. So again, she is not wanting to make dreams something that is apart from reality, but dreams are something that help shape our reality. We need our dreams because if we want the world to change, we have to be able to create something that does not yet exist. We have to create something from our dreams, which means we have to be good at dreaming. We have to turn to our dreams and our poetry to give us strength and courage to see and feel and speak and dare these things that do not yet exist. She says, if what we need to dream to move our spirits most deeply and directly toward and through promise is discounted as luxury, then we give up the core, the foundation of our power, our womanness. We give up the future of our worlds. Right, so those dreams, that language, that creation, that speaking from that sort of core of our feeling and our experiences, that's poetry. And if that gets discounted as being some sort of luxury that only a few people can afford to have, well, then you're just giving up your entire world, right? Poetry needs to be for everyone. And it especially needs to be for those people who are silenced and feel and are oppressed and are suffering, right? They are the ones who most need this language, this way of speaking up, this way of finding their voice. And so she's really saying that poetry is not a luxury. It's not for, the rich or the well-educated or the people with power. Poetry is for people who are disfranchised. Poetry is for people who are suffering. It's for people whose experiences need a voice. So she says, there are no new ideas. There are only new ways of making them felt. And that's what she's really thinking of poetry as doing, is taking our experiences, taking our sort of thoughts and ideas, and finding new ways of making them felt, right? Finding new power for these words so that they can have this sort of impact on the world. So Audre Lorde, right, gives us this idea that poetry really is profound. It's something that everyone has within them if they reach into their feelings and if they're trying to find ways of expressing and communicating those feelings through the creation of new language, by playing with language, by finding new words, new phrases to express that feeling. And so she's really integrating poetry into our everyday lives and also integrating it into our lives in a way where it becomes really meaningful and powerful tool for transforming the world. So she, in some ways, is sort of making poetry have this foundational ground where we all have it. It's very democratic. And she's also making poetry this sort of very important tool for political activism and for creating social change. And so the other videos I want you to look at in relation to Audre Lorde's poetry is this TED Ed talk on what makes a poem a poem. And at the beginning, it begins with Muhammad Ali's shortest possible poem. It's just me, we, and talks about how can this be a poem, this phrase me, we. And it looks at the power of poetic language as this sort of condensed language, which is what Audre Lorde is talking about, this distillation of experience, like taking things and making them their sort of most sort of dense and sort of getting at the core of what that experience is through language. It also talks about the fact that poetry tends to be intense, amplified feelings, the expression of intense, amplified feelings. And so it relates poetry not just to what you think of when you pick up a book of poetry, but also to sort of old religious scriptures, and other things like that. It looks at the way poetry uses really vivid imagery to move us and sort of shift our thinking around. It talks about poetry as having this very sort of powerful, direct way of speaking and addressing us. And it talks too about the idea that poetry, the root word for poetry is poesis, which is a verb, not a noun. And it means, as we said last week, to make or to create. And so this video really talks about the idea that poetry is a way of forging new understandings, which is how Audre Lorde is thinking about poetry. And then I also wanted you to look at 2 videos on rap lyrics, because rap very much is our sort of contemporary mode of poetic language. This video looks at how rap uses language in a way that can help us to think of it as this sort of poetic expression. So rap uses bars and beats to kind of create this sort of rhythmic language, this playing with rhythm. And it has very complex rhyming schemes. So this video goes through a bunch of different raps and shows you the sort of complexity of different rhyming schemes and helps you to think about what is happening with the words and how it sounds and the effect it has on us. Rap also uses motives or motifs, if you want to say it the fancy way, right? These repeating patterns around a theme. And that has to do with the expressivity of the rap, right? Being able to kind of come back to this idea, and every time you come back to it, it's expressed in a slightly different way, and you've built on it. And it also sort of plays with our expectations, and it makes ideas very, very expressive and memorable, right? So there's something about the way that rap uses language that's incredibly poetic and has this really strong impact on us. So this video helps us to think about rap this way. And then this video has to do with why rap is political. So the origins of rap, a lot of it has to do with, right, expressing the perspective of sort of disenfranchised African Americans living in the ghetto, living under these sort of conditions of police brutality, and this sort of perspective that gets expressed ends up being really effective through rap. So this is a very, very short history of rap, and there's a lot more out there if you're interested in learning about how rap kind of becomes this tool for political movements. But this can help us think about Audre Lorde's idea that poetry is not a luxury, right? Poetry is something that's for everyone. Poetry is something that comes out of our experiences, particularly the sort of experiences we want to make sense of. So thank you for listening, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions before you participate in the discussion boards, or feel free to post under the clarification discussion board, which I'll try to answer before Thursday. Thank you so much.